Okay, fantastic. Hey, Plastic Pills listeners, I'm here today with a very special guest, actually. This is Aaron, and he is one of the founders of the Institute for Christian Socialism and an editor of The Bias magazine. For those of you who do not know, ICS and The Bias have made it their mission to actually counteract some of the right-wing interpretations of Christianity and provide a more vibrant and altruistic conception of Christianity that's appropriate to the left for the 21st century. So thanks a lot, Aaron, for coming on. We've been wanting to have you here for a while.
Thanks for having me, Matt. I've wanted to talk to you for a while, so I really appreciate the opportunity.
Perfect. So I have a couple of questions for you, but why don't we just start with the most basic one? What initially inspired the creation of the Institute for Christian Socialism and the Bias magazine? Was it a personal event, a political transition, some combination of the two? You just saw some evangelical ad and that was the last straw?
Yeah, plenty of evangelical ads to build some impetus for this project. And that continues to happen, in fact. No, if I could put it very simply, the Institute for Christian Socialism was formed out of a profound frustration that many of us had with the fact that there was no real voice or organizing space for Christians who wanted to mount a consistent and sustained anti-capitalist critique of society. And a sense that to do that, one would need more than simply, a blog, even a standalone magazine. But that in order to sustain and build a movement around that, we would need something like an institute, right? An institute involves questions of people, right? People power, money, and the sort of network resources, organizing tools that are necessary to actually build a successful and long-lasting Christian anti-capitalist movement. And so we were launched in 2019 around just that mission, essentially to help educate and then organize Christians on the left, right? And to say that is not to say that every single person who encounters ICS or gets involved is themselves a committed leftist or socialist. Many of them are, but kind of the core concern and anxiety many of them have is that something is profoundly wrong with the capitalist order, and they want to fix something about it. And they would prefer not to do that simply through moral denunciations, right? Merely through sectarian solutions, through the church. But they'd like to do something that affects long-lasting political change. And so that's broadly how it came together, really out of a concern not just to do something temporary, to make a small splash, but in fact to contribute to, I think, a landscape change, to fundamentally work towards retaking the landscape of American politics and disrupting the monopolization of religion, and especially Christianity, by the conservative, neoconservative and neoliberal right. And so in that sense, you asked what its genesis was, what the sparking event for it was. I think in many ways that, ICS is not, ICS owes itself to political energies and movements that preceded it, right? I think it's safe to say something like ICS may not have resonated or been as successful as it has been if we had launched even 5 years ago. But I think there's sufficient political frustration, anxiety around many, recent events in our past, the Great Recession, the disastrous wars, right? The experiences of precarity under neoliberal capitalism. And then most recently, kind of the Bernie phenomenon, right? That there was a real viable political voice giving expression to the concerns a lot of young people have who are no longer riding that wave of, the beautiful, post-war capitalist boom. And so, there's a certain energy that we're riding, I think. And now Christians have, I think, much more interest in getting politically organized and mounting a real sustained challenge to it. So that's kind of how it explained how it came about. I can certainly give more detail about like the folks involved and then kind of how our own personal histories led to ICS for sure.
Well, we'll definitely get into that. But just before we do, we're a left-wing podcast. A lot of our listeners are Marxists, or at least aligned, and frankly, irreligious or even anti-religious. And growing up, I was raised Roman Catholic. So were a few of us. I was very devout when I was younger, but one of the reasons I apostatized for a period was just most of the Roman Catholics I knew were pretty big C conservative, and almost all the Catholics I met who were big R religious were big C conservative. And at some point I just said, I had enough, I can't deal with it any longer. So can you tell us a little bit about what the reception of ICS has been? Because honestly, just looking back in my own kind of history, I would have really liked something like this when I was growing up. It would have been really refreshing. Kind of wish it was there in hindsight, but that's the way things go. So how have Christians responded to this generally?
That's a great question. I share with you, Matt, this feeling that had there been something like the Institute for Christian Socialism, our relationship to our faith and our religious past may have been very different. To some people, I'll say, simply ICS saved my faith. That's kind of simplistic, and that kind of looks over the fact that, faith for me is an ongoing struggle every single day. And there are many incentives, many days to just look at the whole project of Christianity, its relation to politics, and say, it's just not worth it. But that said, I think ICS for me has been very integral in restoring my faith in a kind of politically radical socialist Christianity, or at least the possibility of that. So I agree with you there. I mean, you're right. One of the biggest and hardest questions for us to answer, both as we launched ICS and then as we are engaged in the daily work, right, of publishing and speaking and intervening, who is our audience, right? One of the difficulties of ICS is that in creating the Institute, you both have to respond to an audience and create an audience at the same time, right? So to get back to some of the earlier personal stories, a lot of us had real concerns and critiques of our experience of academic spaces and church spaces, where there were nominal commitments and oftentimes very pronounced commitments in the pulpit and in the classrooms to social justice, to progressive values, but very little material investment in those things, right? Very little material analysis of those things, and certainly no willingness to actually criticize capitalism in a forthright way. And so a lot of the genesis of ICS, again, was out of this frustration. So there's a small audience in the sense of those people who were involved in ICS at the start wanted to say, there's nothing out there for people like us who feel so frustrated with this reality. We want to do something about it. So, our first audience was ourselves, right? Trying to collaborate and think about how do we make the sort of developing commitments and critiques that we have public and draw people in. But then we realized once we launched ICS that there were a lot of people out there, and especially I would say not even people who would immediately identify as Christian leftists or socialists, but rather people who had been profoundly burned out by the church or abused by the church or traumatized by other Christians. And so certainly, social media is no perfect indicator of who your audience is. But in the last 2.5 years since we've launched, it's quite clear to us that the people who are attracted to us and engage with us on social media, reach out to us directly, are very often people who have had a negative racialized experiences of being a Christian, right? Queer and trans folk. People who've been kicked out of their family's home, right, for heterodoxy, right, or things like that. So people who have been profoundly alienated and are by no means closed off to the idea of Christianity, but to them it's basically become something that they practice individually, and they really can't find any kind of materialization of their own sense of the radical Jesus, right, and the kind of radical Christianity that they might espouse. And so I think it's a lot of people who are just looking for an institution or organization that really is willing to make good on these claims of a radical Jesus. I think one of the other harder things is it is difficult in our current climate to make any kind of strong political claims about Christianity just because it has been so co-opted by the right. I think a lot of people are very afraid, Christians, I should say, are very afraid to claim the banner of socialism precisely because any sorts of bold radical claims run the risk, right, of playing into the hands of right-wing Christianity, right? And so this is one of the ways that, what Mark Fisher describes as capitalist realism has taken such a strong hold in America. It seems better to kind of couch one's critique of capital and injustice by, kind of organizing around banners like progressivism, right? Radicalism, anarchism, things like that. But there are real risks, I think, to take it on the socialist banner. I mean, among many, it's hard to get funding for institute if you're calling yourself a socialist, right? It's hard to develop strong associations with certain folks that might be privately inclined to support you. But, so that's certainly, a big risk that goes along with it. I think, one of the other difficulties is trying to help people locate where is this Christian socialist tradition, right? I think a lot of people who have come to engage ICS, again, have this experience of being profoundly alone, the sense that there must be no one who thinks like me, no one who's come before me. And so where do I go, right? So part of our task has been to try to reconstruct what we call kind of the Christian socialist tradition, or the socialism of the gospel, as we've dubbed it, to look to those figures who have practiced radical economic, political, and social justice, those who have always stood sometimes within the church, but very much outside of it to critique it from the outside, and call it to the virtues of justice and mercy in a political way. And, one of the things we have to do to successfully organize Christians is remain strongly ecumenical. So ICS is not an organization that demands adherence to one denomination or any denomination, right? And we also have to maintain a kind of ecumenical approach to the secular left, right? So that there's these kind of like constant temptations, I think, with Christians who want to appear radical or anti-capitalist and really double down on their own theological tradition to do that, or to avoid the contributions and the critiques and the education that the secular left can provide, right? And so it's having to kind of like thread that needle, right? Constantly remaining ecumenical, both theologically and politically, is super important. That is the only way that we can actually build power, though, I think, is a successful Christian anti-capitalist institute.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, especially given the hegemony of the American right, not just in the United States, but in terms of the influence it's had on conservatism generally. There needs to be a counter push for Christians and other religious types who feel differently. But the kind of challenge as I see it, and this is a more conceptual question, especially when trying to make Christianity appealing to leftists, is that since at least the 18th century, many different conservatives with reactionary dispositions, even virulently reactionary dispositions, have tended to argue for everything from throne on altar style conservatism with Joseph de Maistre, right down through the evangelical right with its associations with Trumpism and the Republican Party, and the belief that, the gospel tells us that we should work, be thrifty, put our pennies aside, and if you do well, then God will reward you in this life. These things have been tremendously influential. So I imagine at some point it has to feel a bit like scaling a mountain to try to actually make the case for Christian socialism. Can you talk a little bit about how your interpretation of the Christian message is different and why you think it will resonate, beyond just the fact that, of course, you think it's the correct interpretation of the Christian message?
Right. That's a really great question, Matt. Yeah, I can take a stab at that. So actually, I think the first place that I would start is by honestly admitting, actually, that the dominant forms of Christianity across the globe have often been overwhelmingly reactionary. And not just Christianity in the modern era, though you're certainly right to point out that there's a kind of fusion that happens in the modern era that brings them into very close alliance with reactionary thought. The entire project of European Christianity, I would say, is responsible for an outrageous legacy of violence and colonialism and slavery, and one that has profound effects even today. So in other words, I think we need to avoid this kind of common and understandable clapback that you find sometimes in progressive Christian circles. And it's one that conservative Christians engage in too, where it's like, well, sure, a lot of Christians have done terrible things, but that wasn't true Christianity, or they weren't real Christians. But the fact is that some of the most grievous evils of the last 2 millennia have been committed by practicing Christians and the church, and people who profess Christian orthodoxy too, right? They held very strong views, theological views on human sin and failure, and they used those very doctrines to engage in products of violence and domination and class oppression. And they developed very, sophisticated rationales for this violence, using the resources of theology and Christianized philosophy. You can look at recent works like that done by Willie James Jennings on race, right? His thesis is that racial formation didn't have its origins just in colonialism, but also had a theological beginning that fused it to the Western colonial project. You can pick really any systemic world-making evil over the last 2 millennia, and you'll find Christianity lurking there somewhere. Racism, slavery, anti-Semitism, violence against LGBTQ people, women. And it's not even lurking there. In many cases, it's explicitly providing the very frameworks and rationales that legitimate the domination of these people. I think one theologian I would point people to of your podcast that's really important on this front is Marika Rose. She has this great book. It's fairly complex academically, but it's important. And other folks like Dean and Matt at the Magnificast podcast have spoken with her about this idea of Christianity as a kind of ongoing failure and a need to grapple with that failure. But Christianity, she says, has always struggled with and fought against supremacist theology since its very inception. And sort of every new theological current is trying to find a way out of these impasses, right? Trying to assume some normative, standard, pristine Christianity. But I think, honestly, I would say, Matt, one of the most important starting points is like Christian leftists, if they want to be honest about this legacy, have to actually acknowledge the damage and wreckage of Christianity. We have to acknowledge that there is failure there. But there's more that you can say, I think. I mean, ICS obviously exists, and we think that there's something important and vital about Christianity. In the radical life of Jesus, the kind of political love he embodied, and the love that has been extended by many of his followers, and the contribution I think that kind of political love can make to the left. One thing I would point to is actually a book that the members who are part of ICS's membership program are currently reading by Aubrey Hendricks. It's called The Politics of Jesus. And Aubrey's book is profound because what it does is basically make the case that in both Jewish and Christian scripture, the point at which God makes his most explosive entrance onto history, right? Which is his intervention in the oppression of the Hebrews under Pharaoh, is basically a political intervention, right? So this is not just some God who responds to the piety, right, of the Israelites, but instead the very reason God appears and intervenes is to free these people from their political plight as an oppressed social class. And in fact, Israel as a people, often in the Hebrew scriptures, constantly refuses a God, right? And God continues to intervene to free them, not just from some vague spiritual bondage, right? But from actual oppressors. And even as the life of liberated Israel develops after the Exodus, their whole system of political rule is set up around a system that resists monarchs and hereditary rulers. And as that goes on in the life of Jesus, that is the very context in which Jesus begins his own ministry, right? The Hebrew people are now an oppressed colonial subject under Rome. Jesus' experience would have been that of, his parents walking the roads of Rome, seeing Jews crucified on the crosses for rebelling. It would have been one in which he was opposed to an aristocratic hereditary caste, basically, of priests who would acquiesce to Rome's rule and oppress their own people. His challenge was directly to this religious political order that had refused God's sovereignty, right? The one God that Israel worships, and a resistance to the use of wealth and power and privilege that were used to lay these heavy burdens on the Jewish people. In other words, I think the very first thing one has to look at is the fact that Jesus' life was thoroughly political. He grew up in a thoroughly politicized context, and all of his interventions, right, as a teacher, as a minister, as a kind of political radical, took place in a very specific political and social structure of violence and oppression. The liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez talks about this very pervasive idea of Jesus that is I would say no more pronounced than it is in America, right? Especially in the kind of evangelical portrayal of Jesus and spirituality. Jesus becomes kind of just a script, he says. He's deprived of any historical or human content. He's there just saying things that are really just recitations of other theological truths. There's no real body.
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of defanged, is the impression you get from the book.
That's right. That's exactly right. But it's really hard once you kind of take pause and imagine and reconstruct Jesus's own context, right? That Jesus is not, some kind of, easygoing wisdom teacher. He's not confrontational, right? In some general way. He's not just curmudgeonly. He's not someone who enjoys exposing people's individual sins, like my evangelical ancestors told me. His confrontations, his interventions, and his struggles were always focused and specific against the rich, against the Roman imperial order and those who acquiesced to it. And they were always interventions on behalf of the vulnerable and the excluded and the outcast. And so I think it's super important, as Gutierrez says, to realize that like the kind of love that Jesus announces and that he experiences from his Father, it's not some kind of abstraction, right? It's not some kind of sentimental truth that preserves, I think what Gutierrez calls a fictitious harmony, right? It's a love that calls people into solidarity with the oppressed. So this is a kind of love that actually forces you into the process of liberation. And the way Jesus goes about this is his universal love means that he sides with the oppressed, and his struggle against oppressors is not motivated out of a hatred, right, or ambition. In fact, the act of freeing oppressors from their power to oppress is itself an act of love, the kind that Jesus calls us to. So I think it's really important to say that like the example and the life of Jesus show us that like he is not an abstraction. In fact, the center focus of Christianity, the person of Jesus Christ, is thoroughly political. And he calls us to a form of love that is thoroughly engaged, thoroughly material, has profound social and material implications. And it's a kind of love that he calls us to that is very insistent that we must free those oppressed, and to free those who are oppressing is also a kind of political love, if that makes sense. There are all kinds of, structures of theology, readings of scripture, formations of church denominations and the power that they seek to form with other political parties that certainly militate against this radical reading of Jesus. But I think it's just impossible to ignore once you have a holistic view of both the Hebrew and Christian scriptures that is the whole context of God's intervention, especially in the person of Jesus Christ, that he is committed from the beginning and even to the cross to justice, and he dies at the hands of political oppressors, right? Jesus doesn't go to the cross and die there because of some vague, sentimental message about love. He doesn't go there necessarily because of his teaching, but he goes there because of certain life. That teaching and that life is ordered towards freedom of the oppressed. So it's a political death that he goes to the cross committed to this radical liberative love. And I think that's the kind of message that radical leftist Christians are clinging to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. And I mean, I think the point that you made initially, which is that there are many different ways of interpreting the gospel, including right-wing ways, and people need to own the legacy of that is extremely important. It's worth noting that John C. Calhoun, the Vice President of the United States, staunch defender of the South, often appealed to not just religious imagery, but religious arguments and examples in the Bible to support the institution of slavery. On the other hand, of course, we have MLK and the various leaders of the civil rights movement, often emerging in a kind of Southern Baptist tradition that mobilized the resources, imagery, and spirituality of the Bible to stand against racism and tyranny and oppression, right? So there's this constant battle, I would say, in trying to save the emancipatory message of the Gospels from the temptations of chauvinism and this kind of calcification or fetishization of power. Speaking of which, at the moment, there's obviously a very strong Christian right in the United States. Some would even say a kind of burgeoning or aggressive Christian right. And its leading intellectual edge is often perceived to be the so-called post-liberal movement. Now, this is complicated, and some of our listeners might know about this. But broadly speaking, post-liberals tend to emerge out of a right-wing Christian, typically Catholic kind of environment. And they argued that even the kind of capitalist-friendly liberalism that we see in the United States right now isn't going far enough. That we want the United States to emulate a country more like Poland or Hungary, with their kind of quasi-authoritarian governments, their strong restrictions on immigration, particularly immigration from Islamic countries, and the enforcement of a very socially conservative kind of outlook. Can you tell us why you think post-liberalism appeals to so many on the Christian political right, and how can a Christian left confront it intellectually? Since, of course, that's what we're trying to do here on this podcast, amongst other things.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, I could just be really lazy, Matt, and just say, rather than listen to me, just read anything that you or Sam Adler-Bell or Matt Sitman had to say about these things.
I've taken a few shots at them, that's for sure. But
so I think there are a lot of things we could say here. Obviously, the phenomenon of post-liberalism, which, as you say, is overwhelmingly kind of a Catholic anti-liberalism, is emergent. It's constantly changing. It's a project certainly on the move. But I think one thing I've noted about it is that, it partakes of a common strain of conservative Catholicism, which is that it's a reaction to the kind of trauma of secularism and modernity, the loss of religious consensus, the loss of strong authority, a sort of solid place in the world. But, as Freud would say, trauma is usually unspoken, right? It's repressed. So it rears its head in morbid and unrecognized ways. And I think that certainly this Catholic post-liberalism is a kind of morbid symptom of capitalism. Exactly how we can talk about that. First, I think it's important to say it often goes unnoticed, although you have certainly pinpointed this in your pieces on the Catholic post-liberals. But it goes unnoticed, I think, just how reliant post-liberalism is on liberalism and modernity and
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's almost a parasitic relationship in the sense that post-liberals define themselves so strenuously by basically saying, like the Arctic Monkeys once did, whatever it is that they are, we're not.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And again, so I would say the post-liberals aren't stupid in this respect, right? Although they do seem to be, unable to stop saying stupid things on social media. That's true. But at the same time, I don't know about you, but I find a sort of like mendacity, a sort of willful ignorance about just how shaky their whole project is, like on intellectual and theological grounds, right? And I think you grasp that. So I think it's important to kind of mine these vulnerabilities and these contradictions. I think one of the reasons that it can seem so mendacious and willfully ignorant is that it is first and foremost a movement of reaction, like in the sense that Corey Robin talks about, right, in his book, The Reactionary Mind. Yeah, that is, it's a movement of largely elite academics, theologians, and I guess you could say wonks, right, that are fundamentally animated by a desire to repopularize private power in the face of the volatility of capitalism. I think one of the clearest examples of the way this comes up is the way that post-liberals oddly talk about the elite layers of politics and culture, right? Trying to portray themselves and a figure like, for instance, Donald Trump, right, as outsiders speaking for a quiet majority of kind of white working class folks, traditional folks, against like these elite layers of media and politics and Hollywood and the university and things like that, which is just a wildly, I think, incorrect analysis of the way things actually work in America. Though certainly it does leverage some, you could say, some vulnerable points of liberalism, right? It's, I think, inarguable that there are profound problems with the captivity of these, let's call them elite layers of politics and culture because of capitalism, right? But to make these claims, right, that in fact the post-liberals are speaking from the outside, right, as part of this real majority of America, right, that's attempting to retake the totalitarian takeover of like woke elite technocrats, right, everywhere. I think this is very, very silly. Now that said, I do think we should take notice of how close some of this rhetoric is to strands of Christian anti-capitalism. And I would also kind of almost put that in air quotes, more like Christian critiques of like consumerism, right? And
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, one of the problems, of course, they're not necessarily structurally opposed to capitalism. They're opposed to excessive liberal permissiveness, right? And to the extent consumer culture maps onto that. They might be critical of some market outcomes and say the state should constrain them, but they're not really not in favor of confronting the power of capital in any sustained way, transforming social relations by moving to a different economic system. None of that is of much interest to them. Let's just put it that way.
That's right. This is something that you targeted really well, Matt, in your piece on Paul Tillich's little-known book, or at least too little-known book, The Socialist Decision, right? There was a discussion there of what exactly the relationship is of capitalism to freedom, right? And I think one of the things that really sets the post-liberals apart and puts them uncomfortably close, I think, to a lot of Christians that espouse a kind of third way anti-capitalism, right? It could be in the forms of like distributism, corporatism, things like that. The real concern is rooted in anxieties about liberalism, not capitalism per se, right? And so when it comes to the question of freedom, which is something liberalism offers, right, in a kind of radical way, at least at the level of ideas, the problem for post-liberals is not that capitalism makes us too unfree, right? That's the leftist critique, that capitalism certainly creates conditions for freedom, but it systemically blocks them, right, under the rule of capital. The problem for post-liberals is that capitalism has actually made us too free, right? And so this is really rooted in its anxiety, its resentment towards liberalism, I think. That's where the real object of critique is. And so as you rightly pointed out, they're perfectly happy to make certain kind of critiques of capitalism, though they rarely use that term itself, but they might critique corporations, right? The domination of corporations. They may engage in a little bit of sort of critique of the lack of labor unions, right? They may valorize the needs of workers, even use terms like the working class. But in the end,
Sarah Bamari has been on a tear that way recently.
Yes. And for this reason, this is why Sam Elder-Bell is right, I think, to call them like the labor curious post-liberals, right? They have a certain curiosity about the working laboring classes. And they're willing to even engage in some rhetoric about supporting those classes. But in their minds, what they're hearkening back to is not the working class as it actually exists, right? They're hearkening back to a working class that in their minds was solidly centered in, male breadwinning families and the manufacturing industries, right? And so what they're seeking, again, is not so much the dignity of labor, right? Strong working class rights, union power. What they want to do is advocate for labor insofar as it representates, right, a kind of older male white working class. And this is where I think post-liberalism becomes actually, as we both can probably agree, dangerous in some ways, right? It's participated in certain far-right discourses, right, about what's wrong with America, and has shown itself to be quite happy to cozy up with authoritarian leaders, politicians, not just in America, but across the world. So I think, again, what we're dealing with here and what leftists have to be super clear about, especially Christian leftists, because, again, you've pointed this out, Matt, in your writing, we have to make a careful, nuanced case in support of the emancipatory dimensions of liberalism as anti-capitalists, right? We cannot make the reactionary move of trying to get behind liberalism, which is exactly what post-liberals try to do, is to chuck it, even though they may be secretly reliant on it in ways they're not willing to admit, right? Or foreground. But, as Matt Sitman, I believe, has said before, for socialists, we want to go directly through liberalism and radicalize it, right? We want to make it good on its promises. Post-liberals want to get behind it, right? In order to regress, or at least to forcibly introduce, a more homogenous social order, right? That excludes what they see as depraved and licentious forms of like sexual life, right? And the problem of transgender bathrooms, things like that, right? Their critique is solidly focused on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things Sam Adler, amongst others, pointed out, that if you skim through any number of their text, every now and then, as you put it, you'll find some labor light or working class light kind of curiosity. They'll say a nice thing about unions and say some bad things about tech companies. But if you add up all the words that they'll write talking about why it is that we should reconfigure the relationship between capitalists and the working class, and you compare that to all the words they'll fixate on transgender bathrooms, there's really no comparing the two, right? throw in the stuff about, them being opposed to the so-called gay agenda, and it's just, mountains next to molehills. And that really should give you a sense of what it is that they're prioritizing, in my opinion.
That's right, Matt. Yeah, I think that's right. And just the last thing I would say here maybe is again, I want to point out that there is a certain intelligence to post-liberalism in the sense that, like other right-wing populist discourses and far-right discourses and movements, it's able to kind of cynically leverage the failures of liberalism. Like there are real gaping failures of liberalism insofar as it supports and protects the interests of capital, right? It has real failures to realize its own promises, right? Post-liberals will step in and say, feminism itself is the problem, right? Redressing racial inequality itself is the problem. Transgenderism, as they call it derogatively, is out of control, and we're at the brink of the destruction of the nuclear family and all these things. And these are very silly things, right? But they are zeroing in on something that's very important, right? The fact that capitalism constrains and configures liberalism, right? So, for instance, many households with a woman and a man, right, that are at the head of the household are still profoundly unequal in terms of wages and access to the workplace and family care and things like that. The disparities of race across almost all lines are still very pronounced, if not more than they were during the civil rights era. Transgender folks are still widely oppressed, right? Violence is committed against them at outrageous rates. And so these are silly claims to make, but there's a sense in which liberalism has valorized like the abstract, causes of feminism, racial equality, queer liberation, right? But it's not able to actually make material good on those things, right? And so post-liberals step into that gap and say, no, the whole problem is feminists and racial justice and things like that. What we want to say, of course, is that we've barely achieved the kind of substantive progress we need around those things, right? It's not enough to just acclaim them and put them, but it's not enough to simply acclaim them in the classroom. It's not enough to simply, announce that you're on Indigenous land, right? These things have to be made materially present, right? Actual justice has to be achieved here. And very often liberalism itself, under the rule of capital, is unable to do these things.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And in many senses, I've seen a lot of my own projects as being saving liberalism from capitalism, or at least what's best in liberalism from capitalism. Obviously, there are some people who are reticent to embrace that project, but I think it can be achievable. Maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? But that actually is a good segue to my last kind of big picture question, which is, I think that most of our listeners will think that's an admirable project. Definitely there's a need for a kind of Christian left to counteract the influence of the Christian right, whether it's post-liberalism or otherwise. But there'll definitely be at least a few people who are skeptical the whole way down. And you can think about this classical Marxist critique, which holds that religion is an ideological opiate for the masses, and the heart of a heartless world, as he puts it. And the argument made by people who really internalize at least a kind of crude version of this critique is that religion will only ever reinforce a kind of ideological complacency in the face of oppression at best, or will help people graduate towards reactionary movements at worst. So how can you convince them that there is something of value to a radical revolutionary movement, and it's sustainable in the face of the kind of immense pressures that many religious people and others face under neoliberalism? Great question.
I can't claim to convince any of your listeners. That would be a very long conversation. It's you're right that it's a long-standing.
Or dare I say it, convert our listeners, right?
Yeah, right. It's a long-standing line of criticism. It's one that, in fact, has, I think, a lot of power. And so I think you'd find among a lot of people that work in ICS or are collaborators with us some basic appreciation for Marx. And indeed, you'd find many Marxists among us. And I count myself as a kind of Marxist. I think one thing to say is that certainly the whole image of opiate has often been misunderstood, right? Marx didn't have a lot of sympathy for religion, certainly not Christianity. But he was in absolute solidarity with the proletariat, right? And so his analysis of the role of religion for the proletariat is, far more nuanced than, say, the kind of reactionary criticisms of like Richard Dawkins or Daniel.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, I foregrounded the heart of a heartless world part of that quote for that reason, right? In the sense that he's not saying this is just an opiate. In a context where people are exploited and have very little to live for, this can provide a tremendous sense of meaning for them, and it's not to be taken lightly, is the sense in which I read his text.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, precisely right. And this is also why, he writes later that, that religious suffering is an expression of real suffering, right? So he calls on people, or at least says, basically calling people to give up their illusions about their actual condition is to call on them to give up the condition that requires illusions, right? What Marx is engaged in here, I think, is ideology critique, right? He's interested in the way that religion helps to rationalize and to justify the way that the social order works. And I would say Marx, in the way he describes much of religion in the Germany that he inhabits, is 98% spot on, I have to say. But I think, I think we need to ask, whether Marx is engaged here in a critique of what Christians would call God, or whether he's engaged here in a critique of an idol, right? And I think many Christians would happily agree that, for one, atheism is an essential dialogue partner for Christians. It's important, I think, that we learn to radicalize our notion of God by getting rid of idols, especially idols that help to portray God in a way that justifies the status quo, right? Very often conceptions of God go right along with a conception of social order, justice, revolution, things like that. What's possible and impossible, right, in the order of justice.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, just to segue on that, Terry Eagleton wrote a very good book where he pointed out that in many ways, Marx's critique of commodity fetishism joins a long history of Christian and Jewish critiques of idolatry, right? And the way that can be a tool to re-entrench different power dynamics in society.
Right. I mean, Christians have a name for this God, as do many other monotheists, and that name is Mammon, right? And actually, yes, that's right. Commodity fetishism is something that Marx, he employs somewhat religious terms to actually talk about that. There's also the category of what Marx calls abstract value, right? And so like the commodity and the abstract value certainly function as a kind of God, right? A kind of mystified God that gives order to the universe, and especially in the workplace, right? But yeah, I think for Christians, we have a very different idea of who God is, right? That one is, again, drawn from the Hebrew scriptures and the gospel. The Dominican friar Herbert McCabe, talks about how the greatest insight of the Hebrew people was realizing that God is not a God, right? And that he is not a fundamental justification for an oppressive social order. The social order of the Old Testament was rooted in the emancipation of slaves, right, from Pharaoh's political economy. And Christians say that we come to know who God is from what happens to him under colonial Roman powers when they torture him and murder him, right? So I think it's really important to highlight here that there is a God of capitalism. There is a God of slaveholder religion. There is a God of nationalism. But it's certainly for Christians not the God of Jesus, right? And so, yeah, I think there's a lot more dialogue here to be done. I mean, one of the things that we're trying to do at the Bias and the ICS is to actually revive older conversations among people who might identify as Orthodox Marxists, communists. There was a huge explosion of conversation and dialogue, both in America and across the world, during the global communist revolutions that put Christianity and communism and Marxism in conversation in a very productive way. And I think the fact that kind of the new atheism has sucked all the air out of the room, right? And in some cases actually given, I think, non-religious or atheist Marxists a little too much fodder to fight religious folks. I think the nature and the state of that conversation is very impoverished. I also think we should point out, too, that globally speaking, especially in the global South, right, it just is a non-starter, I think, to say that religion can't play an important part, right, in the radicalization of people's politics. And in some sense, it's a very abstract critique because people derive immense energy, I think, and inspiration for socialist and radical and progressive causes all over the world. ICS is one of those examples. We're trying to contribute to that and revive it. So I think also on material grounds, given the state of Christianity and politics across the globe, it's kind of a non-starter for anybody who wants to build a real global leftist movement, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for those of our listeners who are interested, of course, looking at the liberation theology tradition, particularly coming out of Latin America, would be a very important place, I think, for starting to learn about how some of these dialogues can be productively engaged in. Or you can take a look at Paul Tillich's The Socialist Decision, which I think is one of the best books written in a Protestant context on the subject. So listen, Aaron, I really appreciate that you coming on. I just have one last question for you, which is, what do you think is next for ICS and the bias? Where do you see yourself as going? What would you hope to do in a couple of years? And is there anything interesting that'll be coming out in the near future?
Yeah, I sure hope so. Yeah, I can speak to that. The most important development for ICS is the launch of our membership program. So in October, we launched a membership program that is modeled around many different grassroots experiments over the last decades and even hundreds of years, where Christians have gathered and organized at the grassroots in spiritual and political communities to effect change and practice forms of economic democracy. And so what we're doing is gathering people as members into what we call base societies. This does actually harken back to the earlier Latin American base communities. And we're putting people into small groups that are organized around a training, curriculum, spiritual exercises, and organizing practices. And this is to make good on our mission, which is to organize Christians, right? Not just to ask them to find other people to advocate for them or to mobilize around short-term causes, but to actually build a grassroots movement over time that we hope in the next couple of years will be in the thousands. So I would encourage people who are interested in getting to know other Christian socialists and who want to actually form community, Christian anti-capitalist community, to check that out. That's easily found at our website on the membership page. That's where we're looking to actually grow a movement, Matt. So that's the most important thing and the most exciting thing of the last year. Also, we're developing more media. So we'll have a number of new podcasts coming out of ICS. And the bias is actually launching a few series this year. One will look at figures of the Christian left, so resourcing people that may be a little less known on the Christian left and doing profiles of them so people can get to know what this Christian socialist tradition is, locate themselves in it, and then be inspired by their examples. We're also going to be engaging in a couple of long analyses of how Christians are currently engaging in anti-capitalist politics, especially with a lot of focus on some of the insufficient ways they're doing that. And then we're also working in a project to republish older and lesser known works from the Christian left over the past 100 years. There's a lot of little known material that's out of copyright, just waiting to be republished and represented to the public. So we're planning to use the bias as a space for that. Otherwise, I would say people should definitely check out our website, christiansocialism.com. We really want people to join us in this crucial work. It doesn't happen without people. And we're trying to build a responsive institution that actually we can give others access to, right? We talk a lot about ICS exists for the people that are involved in it. In some sense, it's really theirs. And we want to be able to equip them and resource them and organize them to start affecting change in their churches and communities. So christiansocialism.com is where we're at. If you're interested in supporting us, there's also a support page there. You can subscribe to our newsletter. And we're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. So that's Aaron Anderson, everyone. Do check out the ICS website and the Bias magazine. As Aaron mentioned, I've been known to have a piece come out there every now and then as well. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out. But, thanks a lot for coming here, man. And I hope for the best in your organization's future, because I really think this is an extremely important mission. If anything, it's probably more vital now than it has been in many, many decades, given how nasty some of these right-wing Christians happen to be.
Awesome, man. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me on.